The Alpha King didn't visit her because he loved her. He went because he believed she might be stealing from the crown. By sunrise, his entire future would change. For months, strange reports had landed on King Caius Thornvale's desk. The palace kitchens requested nearly twice their usual amount of food. Blankets disappeared every winter before reaching the royal storage rooms. Medicines ordered for the palace infirmary somehow vanished without authorization. The numbers refused to make sense. Someone was taking supplies. The only question was who. One evening, Lady Isolde Ravenscar entered the council chamber carrying another ledger. She placed it neatly before her fiancé. "I've finally discovered the problem." Caius looked up from the reports. "Go on." "A servant." She spoke with complete confidence. "Leora Ashwin." The name meant little to him. He frowned. "The girl who works in the kitchens? And everywhere else?" Isolde folded her hands. "The servants adore her. They protect her. No one is willing to report her because she's convinced them she's doing good." The royal steward, Alden, shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, Leora has served this palace since she was 14. I've supervised her personally. I've never known her to steal so much as a loaf of bread for herself." Isolde smiled politely. "Perhaps not for herself. But supplies continue disappearing. The evidence speaks for itself." The council chamber fell quiet. Caius studied the reports again. The shortages were real, but accusations alone had never satisfied him. He looked toward Alden. "What do you believe?" The old steward answered without hesitation. "I believe appearances often lie, and Leora has earned the right to be judged by truth instead of rumors." Isolde sighed dramatically. "Then let us discover the truth." She turned toward Caius. "If she's innocent, I'll apologize personally. But if she's guilty, the crown cannot ignore it because she's well-liked." Caius slowly closed the ledger. "No." Both looked at him. "I won't send guards. I won't question servants. If someone is truly stealing, I want to see it myself." That evening, he exchanged his royal cloak for ordinary traveling clothes, a plain brown coat, simple boots, no royal crest, no jeweled sword. Even the palace guards barely recognized him. Alden approached quietly. "Your Majesty, you don't have to do this alone. I do. If Leora is innocent, she deserves more than an investigation. She deserves fairness." As sunset painted the sky deep gold, Caius waited near the servants' entrance. One by one, palace workers finished their duties and disappeared into the city. Finally, a young woman stepped through the gate carrying a worn basket. Her clothes were spotless despite a full day's work. She thanked every guard she passed, stopped to help an elderly cook carry a heavy sack, then continued walking without noticing the man quietly following several streets behind. She never entered the busy market. She never visited the comfortable neighborhoods where many palace servants rented rooms. Instead, she walked farther, past the merchant district, past the blacksmiths, past rows of abandoned workshops where broken windows rattled in the evening wind. The streets grew quieter, poorer. Children played barefoot beside crumbling houses. Mothers patched torn blankets beneath dim lanterns. Leora greeted nearly everyone by name. "Good evening, Mrs. Harlow. Tell your grandson I'll bring more medicine tomorrow." She kept walking until she reached a tiny farmhouse, leaning against the edge of the old forest. The roof sagged. One shutter hung crookedly. No palace servant should have been living there. Curious, Caius stepped closer. A warm light flickered through the window. He looked inside, and what he saw made every accusation suddenly feel impossible. Caius stood perfectly still outside the weathered farmhouse. The warm glow spilling through the window painted golden squares across the frozen ground. Inside, life flourished in a place that should have been empty. 12 orphaned wolf pups crowded around a long wooden table, laughing so loudly that the old walls seemed to shake with joy. The youngest couldn't have been older than 4. The oldest was perhaps 13. Their clothes were patched countless times, their shoes barely matched. Yet every face lit up the moment Leora stepped through the door. "You came back!" A little boy ran into her arms. Before she had even set down her basket, she laughed softly and hugged him with one arm while balancing the heavy load with the other. "I promised I would." "You always do." Another child hurried over to help carry the basket to the kitchen. An elderly blind woman stirred a pot of vegetable soup over the fire. Though her cloudy eyes could no longer see, she smiled the instant Leora entered. "I heard your footsteps. You sound tired." Leora kissed the old woman's forehead. "I'll rest later." Nearby, a gray-haired veteran sat patiently repairing tiny shoes. One of his legs ended below the knee, replaced by a carefully carved wooden limb. He looked up with a grateful smile. "Did the palace keep you late again?" "A little, but we're all together now." The words carried such simple happiness that Caius found himself unable to look away. Leora unpacked the basket. Fresh bread, cheese, vegetables, dried meat, everything listed as missing from the palace inventory. Except nothing was being hidden, nothing was being sold. Everything was placed directly onto the table. The children waited politely until everyone had been served. Leora handed the first bowl of soup to the blind woman, the second to the wounded veteran. Only then did she begin serving the children one by one. Each received a warm smile, along with their meal. When the last bowl was filled, the pot was empty. One little girl frowned. "Leora, aren't you eating?" Leora laughed gently. "I had a wonderful dinner at the palace." The little girl smiled with relief. "Good. I worried you'd be hungry again." Caius looked toward the kitchen shelves. There was no hidden food, no second meal waiting. Leora quietly filled a cup with water. That was all. She hadn't eaten, not a single bite. The king felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. After dinner, the children helped clear the table. Leora wrapped each of them in thick wool blankets before bedtime, the same blankets the palace records claimed had been stolen. The blind woman smiled as tiny voices drifted upstairs. "They'll sleep warm tonight." Leora nodded. "That's all that matters." She then opened a small cabinet filled with neatly labeled jars of medicine. The wounded veteran winced while adjusting his wooden leg. Without a word, Leora prepared fresh bandages and carefully treated the irritated skin around the old injury. The medicine came from the royal infirmary, not wasted, not stolen for profit, used exactly where it was needed most. As Caius prepared to step away from the window, something on the nearby table caught his attention. A stack of worn accounting books. Their pages were covered with careful handwriting. Every loaf of bread, every blanket, every coin, every purchase, every donation, recorded with remarkable precision. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been taken for personal gain. The truth had been waiting there all along. And somewhere inside those weathered ledgers, Caius suddenly realized someone else's lies were about to be uncovered. Before sunrise, Caius was already back inside the palace. He did not sleep. The images from the farmhouse refused to leave him. 12 children laughing over a single meal. An elderly blind woman pretending not to notice that Leora had gone hungry. A wounded veteran repairing tiny shoes instead of asking the kingdom for pity. And Leora, smiling through her own hunger so no child would feel guilty for eating. By the time the first council bell rang, his decision had been made. Seal the palace records. The command echoed across the council chamber. Every advisor looked up in surprise. No documents leave this room. Royal Steward Alden, bring me every inventory ledger from the last 5 years. The elderly steward bowed immediately. At once, Your Majesty. Lady Isolde smiled calmly from her seat. I assume you've confirmed my suspicions. Caius met her eyes. I'm confirming the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. For hours, accountants sorted through towering stacks of ledgers, kitchen supplies, medical inventories, charity funds, winter relief shipments. Every page was examined, every signature compared, every missing item traced. The deeper they searched, the stranger the numbers became. One accountant frowned. Your Majesty, the food listed as stolen was officially marked as spoiled. Another looked up from a separate ledger. These blanket shipments were reported as damaged during transport. A third spoke quietly. The medicines weren't missing. The authorization forms were altered after they left the infirmary. The room grew silent. Caius leaned forward. Whose handwriting? The accountant swallowed. The corrections appear to have been made by the office overseeing charitable distribution. Steward Alden slowly placed another document before the king. The office supervised by... He hesitated. Lady Isolde. Every head turned toward the future Luna. For the first time that morning, her confidence faltered. This proves nothing. It proves someone changed the records. Caius remained silent. Continue. More documents appeared. Letters, expense reports, private correspondence. Finally, a sealed packet was opened. Inside rested several unsigned drafts prepared for Lady Isolde's future reforms after her wedding. One sentence caught Caius's attention immediately. The Eastern Orphan Refuge shall be closed. He continued reading. Resources currently wasted on low-value charitable programs should be redirected toward improving noble estates and expanding royal entertainment districts. Another page followed. Winter kitchens provide no meaningful political advantage. Their funding should be discontinued. The council stared in disbelief. One elderly advisor whispered, "She intended to starve the poorest villages." Isolde immediately stood. "You're misunderstanding. Those reforms were about strengthening the kingdom." Caius looked at her quietly. "By abandoning the people who needed us most?" She opened her mouth. No answer came. At last, the king reached into his pocket. He withdrew the silver engagement ring he had carried since their betrothal. The chamber became perfectly still. He placed it gently upon the council table. "I asked myself something last night." His voice remained calm. "If the crown cannot protect its weakest people, what exactly is it protecting?" He pushed the ring toward her. "I will not marry a woman who mistakes compassion for weakness." A quiet gasp spread through the chamber. The engagement was over, not because another woman had captured the king's heart, because one had revealed the emptiness of her own. As the council struggled to absorb what had happened, Caius gave one final order. "Bring Leora Ashwin to the throne room." Alden hesitated. "Should we explain why?" The king slowly shook his head. "No. She has spent long enough expecting punishment for doing what was right. It is time she finally heard the truth." Word spread through the palace before Leora even arrived. The king's engagement had ended. Lady Isolde had left the council chamber in silence. Royal accountants continued carrying stacks of ledgers through the corridors. No one understood what had happened. When a palace messenger found Leora in the kitchens, she was kneading bread for the evening meal. "The king requests your presence in the throne room." Every pair of hands stopped moving. The older cook looked at Leora with worried eyes. "You should let me come with you." Leora smiled gently. I'll be all right. Though, in truth, she wasn't certain of that herself. She washed the flour from her hands, smoothed her simple apron, and quietly followed the messenger through the palace. As the great doors of the throne room opened, hundreds of eyes turned toward her. The royal council stood on either side of the chamber. Generals, judges, advisors, even the palace servants had gathered quietly at the back. Leora's heart sank. She assumed the investigation had ended exactly as Lady Isolde predicted. She walked to the center of the room and bowed deeply. Your Majesty, if I have done something wrong, I accept whatever punishment the crown believes is fair. The words struck Caius harder than he expected. She truly believed she was about to be condemned. He stepped down from the throne, not as a king addressing a servant, as one person speaking honestly to another. Leora. She slowly lifted her head. I visited your home. Confusion flickered across her face. My home. I saw the children. Her eyes widened. The blind woman. The wounded veteran. The blankets. The medicine. Silence filled the hall. You knew. She looked down. I hoped no one would notice. A quiet murmur rippled through the gathered nobles. Caius studied her gently. There is one question I need answered. She nodded. When the accusations began, why didn't you defend yourself? Leora thought for only a moment. Because proving I was innocent would have taken time. Her voice remained soft. The children were hungry that same night. If I spent hours arguing, they would have gone to bed waiting. So, I decided it was more important to feed them than defend myself. No one spoke. Even the generals who had spent their lives on battlefields lowered their eyes. The answer carried more strength than any speech. Caius turned toward the assembled court. The investigation is complete. Leora Ashwin stole nothing. He paused. Every missing loaf of bread fed hungry children. Every blanket warmed abandoned families. Every vial of medicine healed forgotten veterans. He looked back at Leora. The only crime committed in this palace was allowing rumors to outweigh truth. Before the astonished court, Caius bowed his head. I owe you an apology. A king had apologized to a servant. The entire throne room stood frozen. Leora looked genuinely distressed. Your Majesty, please, you don't have to apologize. Yes. His voice was quiet but unwavering. I do. She hesitated, then smiled with the same gentle kindness that had welcomed every orphan into her little farmhouse. If you truly wish to make things right. She glanced toward the council. Promise me something. Name it. No child in this kingdom should ever wonder where tomorrow's meal will come from. The request was so simple and so selfless that several council members quietly wiped away tears. Caius smiled. You could have asked for wealth or a title. Leora shook her head. They're only useful if people stop being hungry. For the first time in many years, the throne room erupted into applause. Not for a victory, not for a royal decree, but for a servant whose greatest concern had never been herself. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Caius found himself asking one silent question. If this was the woman she was, when no one was watching, who might she become if the kingdom finally stood beside her? Caius kept his promise. Within a week, new grain shipments reached every orphan refuge in the kingdom. The winter kitchens received permanent funding. The royal infirmary established a separate supply line for forgotten veterans and struggling families, so that no servant would ever again have to choose between obeying palace rules and feeding hungry children. The council praised the reforms. Leora barely noticed. She was too busy carrying soup to a widow whose husband had passed away the week before. One evening, as she prepared to leave the palace with her familiar wicker basket, Caius appeared beside the servants' entrance. He wore the same plain brown coat he had used during his secret investigation. No royal crest, no guards, only an easy smile. Leora blinked in surprise. "Your Majesty." He laughed softly. "Tonight, I'm just Caius." She looked uncertain. "I don't think that's possible." "It is, if you let it be." He picked up an extra basket, resting by the doorway. "I was hoping I could help." She hesitated. "You don't know where we're going." "Then you'll have to show me." For the first time, they walked through the city side by side. The poor district greeted Leora with familiar smiles. Children waved excitedly. An elderly baker pressed 2 warm rolls into her hands. "For the little ones," she thanked him and quietly slipped a few coins into his apron pocket. When he wasn't looking, Caius noticed. "You paid him. He can barely afford flour." Leora smiled. Kind people deserve kindness too. At the farmhouse, the children rushed outside. One little boy pointed at Caius. "Who's your friend?" Leora glanced at the king. "This is Caius." The children accepted the answer without another question. To them, he was simply another adult carrying bread. Soon, he found himself repairing a broken fence with the wounded veteran, while Orion, the oldest orphan, handed him nails one by one. Inside, Leora helped the blind grandmother prepare supper. After dinner, she gathered the youngest children around the fireplace and opened a worn storybook. Her voice transformed every page into an adventure. The room filled with laughter. Even Caius forgot he was a king. Later, they visited an elderly widow whose roof had begun leaking after heavy rain. Without being asked, Caius climbed onto the roof with fresh wooden shingles. Leora held the ladder steady. "You've done this before," he smiled. "My father insisted every prince learn to repair a roof before learning how to wear a crown." She laughed. "I think he was a wise man." When the work was finished, they sat quietly beneath the stars outside the widow's cottage. The streets had grown peaceful. Most homes had gone dark. Caius looked at Leora. "You know every family." She nodded. "They've become my family. You remember birthdays. They're important. You know everyone's favorite soup." She smiled. "It makes hard days a little brighter." He watched her for a long moment before asking the question that had lingered in his heart all evening. "When do you rest?" She looked toward the lights glowing from the little farmhouse. "When everyone else finally can." The words settled gently into the silence. Simple, honest, unforgettable. For the first time in his life, Caius realized that the strongest people were not those who carried swords. They were the ones who quietly carried everyone else. The following morning, the royal council gathered with a single demand. "It is time, Your Majesty, to choose a new Luna." The royal council wasted no time. Within days of ending his engagement to Lady Isolde, invitations spread across the continent. Noble families arrived at the palace with elegant daughters, each hoping to become the next Luna of Blackthorn. The grand ballroom glittered once more. Silk gowns swept across polished floors. Jewels sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Every conversation carried the same expectation. The king would choose again. Caius attended every formal reception. He greeted each guest with courtesy. He listened patiently to speeches about powerful alliances, influential bloodlines, and prosperous futures. Then he quietly excused himself each evening, not to meet another noblewoman, but to carry baskets of bread through the poorest streets beside Leora. The contrast became impossible to ignore. One morning, Chancellor Alden approached him before council. "Your Majesty, the nobles are beginning to ask questions. They deserve answers." Caius nodded thoughtfully. "They'll have one today." That afternoon, the throne room filled beyond capacity. Representatives from every great house waited eagerly. Many believed the king would announce his new engagement. Instead, Caius rose from the throne, holding a single royal decree. Our kingdom has protected its borders for generations. He looked slowly across the assembled court. But we have neglected something equally important. Our people. Quiet murmurs spread through the hall. Today, I establish a new office within the crown. He unfolded the decree. Royal Guardian of the People. The title echoed through the chamber. Confused nobles exchanged puzzled glances. The guardian shall oversee orphan care, winter relief, public clinics, veterans' welfare, and charitable works throughout the kingdom. Caius smiled faintly. And I have already chosen the first person worthy of the position. The great doors opened. Leora stepped inside, wearing her familiar servant's apron, still dusted lightly with flour from the palace kitchens. She looked completely bewildered. Your Majesty, I believe there's been a mistake. There hasn't. He walked down the steps toward her. I can't accept this. She shook her head quickly. I'm only a servant. No, his voice carried through the silent hall. You've been serving this kingdom longer than anyone standing in this room. You simply never asked to be recognized. The council watched in stunned silence. Leora looked almost frightened by the attention. I don't know how to govern. Caius smiled. You already do. You've spent years managing homes, feeding families, comforting the grieving, and solving problems no one else even noticed. Titles don't create servants. They reveal them. She looked down at the decree in her hands. If I accept, she hesitated. May I ask for one condition? Anything. I don't want a larger house. I don't need servants. I'd rather every coin meant. For my office, build another clinic. A quiet wave of emotion swept across the chamber. One elderly noble whispered, She truly doesn't want anything for herself. Caius looked at her with quiet admiration. Then that's exactly what we'll do. Leora finally nodded. I'll serve, not because she desired power, but because refusing would mean refusing the people she had always loved. Over the months that followed, clinics opened in forgotten villages. Winter kitchens doubled across the kingdom. Orphan homes received permanent funding. Veterans found work instead of pity. The people soon stopped calling Leora a servant. They began calling her something far greater, the heart of the kingdom. As the first harvest festival approached, the entire realm wondered if the king had one final surprise waiting beneath the autumn moon. The harvest festival arrived beneath a sky painted with gold and crimson. For generations, it had been the kingdom's grandest celebration. Farmers displayed their finest harvests. Children raced through the market carrying ribbons and carved wooden wolves. Musicians filled the streets with joyful songs, while lanterns glowed long after sunset. The palace square overflowed with people. Many believed the king had called such a magnificent gathering for one reason. He would announce his new Luna. Noble families stood proudly near the front of the crowd, their daughters dressed in embroidered gowns, each hoping destiny had finally chosen her. Leora paid little attention to the rumors. She spent the morning exactly as she always did, helping volunteers distribute fresh bread to orphaned children, making sure every elderly guest had a warm meal before the speeches began, straightening little coats, tying loose scarves, laughing with children who insisted on showing her the pumpkins they had grown. To her, the festival had never been about crowns. It was about making sure no one celebrated alone. As the afternoon sun settled low over the palace, Chancellor Alden stepped onto the stage. The Alpha King The crowd erupted into applause. Caius walked forward, wearing his ceremonial robes, but there was something different about him. He carried no royal decree, no jeweled crown, only a small velvet box in one hand. After thanking the people for another successful harvest, he looked across the sea of faces. Then, without warning, he stepped down from the stage. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd. He walked past rows of nobles, past visiting dignitaries, past the daughters of powerful alpha families. He didn't slow until he reached the long table where volunteers were serving bread. Leora looked up in surprise, a basket still resting in her arms. "Your Majesty." He smiled. "I've been looking for you." The children around her giggled. One little boy whispered loudly, "I think the king forgot where the stage is." Laughter rippled gently through the crowd. Caius chuckled. "No, I finally found exactly where I was meant to stand." He set the velvet box aside. Then, before thousands of astonished citizens, the Alpha King knelt. A collective gasp swept through the square. "Leora Ashwin." His voice carried clearly through the autumn air. "The first time I followed you, I believed I would uncover a thief." He smiled warmly. "Instead, I found the woman who had been quietly saving my kingdom, while the rest of us were too busy counting bread instead of blessings." Tears filled Leora's eyes. He opened the velvet box. Inside rested a simple silver ring. No enormous jewel, no elaborate royal crest, just a design of two intertwined branches. "I don't need a queen because she was born into nobility. I need the woman who taught a king how to truly see his people." He held out the ring. "I know you've never wanted a crown." She laughed softly through her tears. "That's true." "I know." He reached gently for her hand. "And that's exactly why you're worthy of wearing one." The children watched with wide smiles. One little girl tugged at Leora's apron. "If you become queen, can we still have dinner together?" Leora knelt beside her and kissed her forehead. "Only if you promise to remind me." The little girl grinned. "It's a deal." Leora looked back at Caius. "Then I have one condition." He smiled knowingly. "I thought you might. The children still get dinner first." He laughed. "Every single day." She slipped the ring onto her finger. The kingdom erupted into thunderous applause, not because a servant had become a queen, but because everyone already knew she had been the heart of the kingdom long before she ever wore its crown. Queen Leora never asked for a larger throne. In fact, she asked for a smaller office. On the morning after the wedding, royal architects proudly presented plans for an elaborate queen's wing overlooking the palace gardens. "It will be completed within 2 years," one of them announced. Leora studied the drawings quietly before looking up. How many village clinics could this build instead? The architects exchanged uncertain glances. Chancellor Alden answered honestly. "At least 12. She gently rolled up the plans. "Then build the clinics. I already have a place to sleep." The story spread through the kingdom before sunset. People couldn't believe their new queen had traded a palace expansion for hospitals. But those who truly knew Leora weren't surprised at all. It was exactly what she would have done as a servant. Only now she could help even more people. Months became years. The Blackthorn Kingdom slowly transformed. Winter kitchens opened in every province, ensuring no family faced the cold with an empty stomach. Mobile clinics traveled to remote mountain villages, where healers had never reached before. Orphaned children received free schooling, warm clothing, and apprenticeships instead of growing up forgotten. Veterans who had once begged in the streets became teachers, craftsmen, and village guards, sharing their experience with the next generation. Whenever a new project was completed, people praised the king. Caius always corrected them. Thank the queen. She saw these needs long before I did. Yet Leora refused statues, celebrations, or festivals held in her honor. If people have time to carve my face into stone, she would say with a smile, they have time to plant another orchard. Even after becoming queen, she still visited the little farmhouse every week. The 12 orphaned wolf pups were no longer tiny children. Some had become healers. Others were carpenters, teachers, and farmers. The eldest now managed the refuge, welcoming new children with the same warmth Leora had once shown him. The blind grandmother spent her afternoons knitting blankets for newborns. The old soldier taught young apprentices how to repair shoes instead of replacing them. The house that had once survived on scraps had become a place where hope quietly multiplied. One afternoon, Caius found Leora sweeping the farmhouse porch. He leaned against the fence and smiled. You know, there are people whose entire job is to clean now. She laughed without looking up. And deprive myself of honest work? I wouldn't dream of it. He picked up a second broom, resting nearby. Without another word, he began sweeping beside her. A group of passing children stopped to stare. One little boy whispered to his sister, "Is that really the king?" She nodded. "And the queen. They're cleaning." The old soldier overheard and chuckled. A good ruler never forgets where service begins. Years later, visitors arriving at the palace noticed something unusual. The grand portrait of Queen Leora showed her wearing royal robes, but beneath the flowing cloak, the corner of a simple servant's apron remained visible. Some nobles suggested painting it out. Caius immediately refused. Leave it exactly as it is. That apron reminds us who she was, long before any crown recognized her worth. Soon afterward, stonemasons gathered at the palace entrance to unveil the inscription Queen Leora had chosen for every future ruler who walked through those gates. The morning the new inscription was unveiled, the entire kingdom gathered before the palace gates. Farmers stood beside nobles, veterans stood beside young apprentices. Former orphans stood beside palace officials. No one had been invited because of rank. They had been invited because the words belonged to everyone. Queen Leora stepped forward, wearing her royal cloak. Beneath its edge, the familiar servant's apron could still be seen. She had never hidden it. She never would. King Caius stood quietly beside her. Together, they pulled away the long white cloth covering the carved stone. Sunlight fell across the inscription. Judge no one by the rumors surrounding them. Walk to their doctor before you decide who they truly are. Silence settled over the crowd, not because the words were difficult to understand, because nearly everyone could remember a time they had believed gossip before seeking truth. Caius looked toward the young alpha heirs gathered in the front row. Every future ruler of the allied kingdoms now visited Blackthorn before claiming a throne. They expected lessons about diplomacy. Instead, Caius led them beyond the palace walls. He always stopped before a small farmhouse at the edge of the poorest district. It had been lovingly restored over the years, but it remained simple. Children still laughed inside. Fresh bread still baked in the old kitchen. The blind grandmother's rocking chair remained beside the fire, preserved in her memory after she peacefully passed away. The old soldier's workbench still held tiny shoes waiting to be repaired by new apprentices. One curious prince finally asked, Your Majesty, why do you always bring us here first? Caius smiled. Because this is where I almost made the greatest mistake of my life. He rested one hand on the weathered door. I came here expecting to expose a thief. He looked toward Leora. Instead, I found the person already carrying my kingdom, while the rest of us argued over numbers in ledgers. The young rulers listened without speaking. Leora stepped forward. Never assume kindness is weakness. Never mistake quiet service for insignificance. And never believe you know someone's story until you've been willing to stand where they stand. Those lessons spread farther than any royal law. Years later, kingdoms across the continent established community kitchens modeled after Leora's little farmhouse. Orphan refugees received permanent funding. Veterans found honorable work instead of forgotten corners of crowded cities. The greatest reform the Blackthorn Kingdom ever exported was not a policy. It was perspective. On warm evenings, Caius and Leora often returned to the farmhouse together. They would sit on the old porch as children chased one another through the fields. One evening, Caius looked toward the fading sunset and smiled. I followed you because I thought you were stealing from me. Leora laughed softly. And what did you discover? He reached for her hand. That you had been giving away everything you had, while I still had so much left to learn. She squeezed his hand gently. Then we both received something valuable. What was that? You learned to see. And I learned that sometimes someone really will knock on your door before judging your heart. History remembered Queen Leora as the servant who became a queen. King Caius remembered her differently. She was the woman who taught him that crowns did not make people worthy of trust. Character did. The Alpha King visited his servant, expecting to uncover a thief. Instead, he found a woman feeding the forgotten with empty hands. In a full heart, he rejected the Luna he had chosen, not because he found someone of higher birth, but because he finally recognized the queen his kingdom had needed all along.